Donald Trump just sat with Joe Rogan for 3 straight hours. And what came out of his mouth left millions speechless. Picture it: the studio lights low, the iconic red curtain glowing faintly in the background, Joe Rogan leaning in with that curious half-smile, and Trump, larger than life, rambling into the microphone with the bravado of a man who's convinced the world still revolves around him. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a campaign rally. It was raw, unfiltered Trump, unleashed in a setting that's notorious for pulling truths out of even the most polished guests. And here's the kicker: in those 180 minutes, Trump didn't just talk politics. He exposed himself, his fears, his arrogance, his contradictions, in ways no one could have scripted. Rogan barely had to push. Sometimes, all he did was raise an eyebrow, or let the silence hang, and Trump filled it with revelations that ricocheted across the internet within minutes. This wasn't just another podcast episode. It felt like watching a high-stakes tightrope act, where at any moment, a single slip of the tongue could send shockwaves through the political landscape. Millions tuned in not for answers, but for the spectacle, to see whether Trump, stripped of teleprompters and carefully curated sound bites, would soar or stumble. And stumble he did, over and over. Yet, in the chaos of his storytelling, 6 moments stood out above all else. 6 bombshells so jaw-dropping, so impossible to ignore, that they're already being dissected by pundits, memed by TikTok teens, and whispered about in political war rooms. What he revealed in those 3 hours wasn't just politics. It was legacy shaping. It was the kind of content that makes or breaks campaigns. And the reactions. Well, even some of his most loyal supporters had to take a deep breath and admit, this wasn't the Trump they thought they knew. Because one of these 6 takeaways didn't just challenge his critics. It made his own base squirm in their seats. And if you thought the opening was explosive, wait until you hear what comes next. Why did this conversation matter so much? Why did 3 hours of podcasting feel more consequential than weeks of campaign rallies or hours of cable news? Because Joe Rogan's podcast isn't just another show. It's the largest long-form stage in America. This isn't a 10-second soundbite on CNN, or a heavily edited clip on Fox News. This is where guests are stripped of their filters. No script, no teleprompter, no safety net. Just 2 men in a room, microphones hot, cameras rolling, and an audience in the tens of millions listening to every word, every pause, every stumble. For Trump, the stakes couldn't have been higher. After years of dominating the headlines with rallies, tweets, and controversies, stepping into Rogan's arena was a gamble. Here, charisma alone wouldn't cut it. Here, the bluster could be tested. Because Joe Rogan, love him or hate him, has a way of cutting through rehearsed talking points with nothing more than a raised eyebrow, a well-timed pause, or a follow-up question that lingers in the air just a little too long. Trump walked into that studio with his trademark confidence, but what he didn't seem to realize is that this wasn't his home turf. A campaign rally is an echo chamber. The crowd cheers, the chants drown out the critics. But in Rogan's studio, there are no chants, just silence, silence that can make even the most powerful men sweat. And the audience knew it. Millions tuned in, leaning forward on couches, scrolling on their phones, headphones in, waiting. It was like watching a man on a tightrope, swaying in the wind. Would Trump dominate the room as he always claimed to dominate every stage? Or would 3 unbroken hours of conversation expose weaknesses no campaign ad could ever hide? This was more than entertainment. It was a stress test for the man who wants to reclaim the White House. A test not of policies alone, but of presence, of stamina, of authenticity. Could he handle scrutiny when stripped of applause? Could he survive when his only ally in the room was the sound of his own voice? The brilliance, and the danger, of Rogan's platform is its length. In 3 hours, there's nowhere to run. You can't rely on a clever one-liner, or a rehearsed story. Every exaggeration, every contradiction, every flash of temper eventually comes to the surface. Long-form conversation doesn't just reveal ideas, it reveals character. And that's exactly what made this podcast different. For Trump, it wasn't about winning a debate stage or firing up a crowd. It was about showing who he really is when the cameras don't cut away, when the silence lingers, when the host just lets him talk. And talk he did. In fact, Trump filled the silence so aggressively that at times, it felt like he was debating himself. He interrupted his own sentences, contradicted his earlier points, and circled back to stories that seemed more about performance than truth. For his loyal fans, it was vintage Trump, raw, unfiltered, unpredictable. For his critics, it was proof of everything they'd warned about for years. But here's the twist buried in the noise: 6 takeaways emerged. 6 moments so sharp, so revealing, that they couldn't be ignored. These weren't the kind of polished lines you see in campaign ads. These were unscripted truths. some deliberate, some accidental, that showed us sides of Trump rarely seen. And the very first takeaway, it revealed something no campaign strategist could ever spin. The first bombshell didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, almost casually, in the middle of one of Trump's sprawling stories. And that's what made it so devastating. See, Donald Trump has always relied on his greatest weapon, storytelling. He weaves anecdotes like a showman on stage, turning every question into a performance, every detail into a punchline. But on Joe Rogan's podcast, that overconfidence became his undoing. Within minutes, the cracks began to show. He told one version of a story, a boast about his achievements, his negotiations, his so-called victories. And then, before Rogan even pressed him, he shifted into another version that contradicted the first. It wasn't subtle. It was glaring. And Rogan, master of the long pause, didn't need to say a word. He just leaned back, raised an eyebrow, and let the silence linger. The effect was electric. Millions watching knew that look. Rogan's silence was louder than any argument. It was as if the host was saying, "Wait, did you just hear yourself?" without ever moving his lips. And in that pause, Trump did what he always does when faced with scrutiny. He kept talking. He filled the silence with more words, more exaggerations, more self-contradictions. What started as confidence quickly spiraled into rambling. The mask, the carefully crafted persona of total control, began to slip. For years, critics had accused him of bending the truth, of reshaping reality to fit his narrative. But here, in real time, the audience saw it for themselves. Not in a headline, not in an edited clip, but in the raw, uncut stream of his own voice. And the internet noticed immediately. Within minutes, clips of the contradiction exploded across TikTok and Twitter. Side-by-side captions read, "Trump said Tice," then 5 minutes later said Tate. Memes plastered Rogan's raised eyebrow over Trump's rambling. Hashtags like "for Trump slip" and "have to just admit that" trended by the hour. What made it powerful wasn't just the contradiction. It was that Trump seemed completely unaware of it. He believed his words carried authority simply because he spoke them. He thought the performance was enough to keep people dazzled. But Rogan's silent reactions, the viral edits, and the audience's sharp memory proved otherwise. The contradiction cut deeper because of where it happened. On a debate stage, Trump could bulldoze over opponents, shout down moderators, and drown contradictions in volume. But here, there was no opponent, no referee, just Trump versus himself. And in that arena, his own words became the weapon that pierced through the image he had so carefully built. Supporters scrambled online to defend him. "He didn't mean it like that," they argued. Critics crowed, "We told you so." But beyond the noise, there was something undeniable. The first takeaway from this historic podcast wasn't a bold policy statement or a calculated attack. It was a revelation of weakness, hidden in plain sight. And weakness, in Trump's world, is the one thing he can't afford to show. This was the moment millions realized that when you strip away the chants, the applause, and the teleprompters, Trump isn't invincible. He's fallible, human, vulnerable to the weight of his own contradictions. But here's the catch: as dramatic as this first slip was, it was only the opening act. Because the second takeaway wasn't about what Trump said at all. It was about what he couldn't say. It was about silence, and that silence spoke louder than any contradiction ever could. If the first takeaway was about contradiction, the second was about something even more damning: the absence of words. It happened roughly 40 minutes in. Trump, energized by his own momentum, leaned forward and made a claim so outrageous, so detached from reality, that even Joe Rogan, a man who has interviewed astronauts, scientists, fighters, and conspiracy theorists of every stripe, didn't know what to say. The moment hung in the air like a storm cloud. Rogan blinked. He tilted his head slightly, mouth half open as if preparing to reply, but nothing came out. Instead, there was only silence. Not the comfortable silence of two men deep in thought. No. This was the heavy silence of disbelief. The kind of silence that makes your stomach clench. The kind that forces the audience to lean forward, waiting to see who will break it first. Trump didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he noticed too much. He doubled down, his voice growing louder, his gestures bigger, as if sheer volume could compensate for the absurdity of what he'd just said. Rogan chuckled, not a laugh of agreement, not even amusement, but an awkward, nervous chuckle. The kind of sound you make when you're caught between correcting someone and letting them dig their own grave. And that chuckle only made the silence louder. For the millions watching, the tension was unbearable. Imagine the live chats scrolling at lightning speed. Bruh, even Rogan is speechless. Wait, did he really just say that? This is painful to watch. He's cooked. Clips of Rogan's expression went viral within minutes. Screenshots of his raised eyebrows, the uneasy smirk, The way he leaned back in his chair, as if to physically distance himself from the words filling the room. All of it became instant meme material. And here's the deeper truth. Silence can be more powerful than argument. Rogan didn't need to fact-check him on the spot. He didn't need to fire back with data or statistics. The long pause, the awkward chuckle, the visible discomfort. That was the verdict. And the audience knew it. Because silence, in this context, was agreement with the obvious: Trump had gone too far. For Trump, who thrives on energy, on applause, on the constant rhythm of call and response, that silence was poison. It was the one thing he couldn't overpower. No amount of hand gestures or exaggerated tone could drown out the fact that the man across from him, one of the most influential interviewers alive, had nothing to say. And maybe that's why the moment hit so hard. Words can be spun, silence can't. Silence is raw, silence is honest, silence is undeniable. The viral reaction proved it. Memes compared the pause to famous movie scenes. Characters staring in disbelief, record scratches freezing the action, captions like, "That was the moment Rogan knew." The internet had a field day. For once, Trump's words weren't the star of the show. His silence was. And yet, as devastating as that pause was, it wasn't the end. In fact, it set the stage for something even more dramatic. Because if silence revealed the cracks in Trump's performance, the next moment lit the fuse that would send the whole conversation spiraling. Because what came next wasn't silence. It was fire. If silence was the sting, then what followed was the explosion. Stung by the awkward pause, Trump did what he always does when he senses weakness. He lashed out. The tone of the room shifted almost instantly. Gone was the half-smiling, anecdote-spinning Trump of the first hour. In his place emerged the fighter, the man who thrives on conflict, who feeds on enemies both real and imagined. His voice rose sharper now, the cadence less rehearsed and more raw. He began swinging wildly at critics, the media, political opponents, even former allies. Each jab delivered with escalating anger, as if he needed to drown the silence of a few minutes ago beneath a flood of fury. Rogan leaned forward, hands steepled, trying to redirect. He attempted to cut in. Not with confrontation, but with gentle pivots, the kind of host's trick designed to steer a guest back on course. But Trump wouldn't budge. The more Rogan nudged, the more Trump doubled down. It was no longer a conversation. It was a monologue. Trump's words turned into a barrage, painting himself as the eternal victim of conspiracies, persecution, betrayal. The studio, once filled with the energy of curiosity, now bristled with heat. Even Rogan's subtle shifts in body language, leaning back, crossing his arms, glancing off to the side, told the story the guest was out of control. And here's the irony in Trump's mind: this was dominance. This was power. But to the millions watching, it came across differently. His charm had curdled into aggression, his confidence into defensiveness. What was meant to project strength revealed something far more vulnerable. A man rattled, a man desperate to claw back control after a moment of exposed weakness. The internet once again erupted. Viewers clipped the exact moment the tone shifted, side-by-side edits showing smiling Trump morphing into angry Trump. Comments poured in. He lost it right here. This is when the mask completely cracked. You can see Rogan regretting this in real time. It was villainy at its peak. Arrogance, rage, and the refusal to let go. For Trump, escalation felt like fighting back. For the audience, it looked like unraveling. And yet, this spiral of anger wasn't the climax. It was only the setup. Because while Trump raged, while Rogan tried in vain to steer the ship, something far more devastating was waiting just around the corner. Because the stage was now perfectly set. Not for more ranting, not for more silence, but for a mic-drop counterattack that would flip the entire conversation on its head. The escalation had reached its boiling point. Trump, flushed with anger, firing shots in every direction, was filling the room with heat. But then, in a moment that caught everyone off guard, Joe Rogan did something he rarely does with powerful guests. He pushed back. Not with aggression, not with hostility, but with a quiet, deliberate contradiction. The kind that slices sharper than any shouted argument. It happened as Trump launched into one of his sweeping claims, a grand tale of victory and inevitability, painting himself as the eternal winner. He rattled off numbers, exaggerated achievements, and framed history as though it bent to his will. But Rogan, ever the detail-oriented skeptic, leaned in and said, simply, "Wait, that's not what happened." The words landed like a thunderclap. Trump froze for just a fraction of a second, his hands mid-gesture. His eyes darted, and for the first time in the entire 3-hour marathon, his confidence visibly wavered. He stumbled. He backtracked. He tried to pivot into another story, but Rogan didn't let him off the hook. "No, but you just said this. And the record shows something else." The silence that followed wasn't like the earlier pause. This was different. This was surgical. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving nothing but the sound of Trump's tangled words as he scrambled to regain footing. For the audience, it was pure cinematic tension. You could feel the collective heartbeat of millions of viewers quicken. The comment sections lit up in real time. Oh my God, Rogan actually challenged him. This is it. This is the moment. Trump is stammering. Trump's response only made things worse. Instead of delivering a clean rebuttal, he layered contradiction upon contradiction. He circled back, rephrased, contradicted again, his sentences looping like a snake eating its own tail. The more he spoke, the more the mask slipped. Rogan, sensing the power of restraint, said almost nothing. He just let the words unravel. Every second Trump talked, he dug deeper into the hole Rogan had silently prepared. And then Rogan dropped the line, short, sharp, devastating, "Seaman, man. That doesn't add up." It was the closest thing to a knockout punch in a podcast. Not yelled, not screamed, just stated plainly, with the calm confidence of someone who knows the receipts are on his side. The reaction was instant. Clips went viral across every platform, tagged with captions like, "Rogan cooked Trump on his own show," and, "The unraveling begins." Memes plastered Trump's face mid-stammer with Rogan's words beneath. You could practically hear the internet cackling in unison. But what made this moment seismic wasn't just the mockery. It was the ripple effect. For the first time, even some of Trump's loyalists couldn't dismiss it outright. Conservative forums, usually a fortress of blind defense, erupted in debate. Okay, I support Trump, but Rogan had a point here. This clip looks bad. No way around it. We can't just ignore this. He got caught. It was as though Rogan had cracked open a window in a sealed room, and fresh air came rushing in. The debate spilled beyond politics into culture itself. Podcasts, late-night shows, and TikTok creators all dissected the clip frame by frame. Was this the moment Trump finally met someone he couldn't out-talk? For Trump, whose image has always depended on control. Control of the stage, control of the crowd, control of the narrative. This was a brutal reversal. Here, in front of millions, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the strongman. He wasn't the master of the moment. He was the man scrambling, caught off balance, undone by the simplest of contradictions. The beauty of Rogan's pushback lay in its understatement. He didn't attack. He didn't grandstand. He simply let Trump's words collapse under their own weight. It was the power of stillness against the chaos of noise, dignity against arrogance. And in that contrast, something shifted. For viewers who had grown used to Trump steamrolling over interviewers, this was different. Rogan didn't fight him with volume. He dismantled him with patience. And the audience, whether they loved or hated Trump, felt the difference. By the time the podcast moved on, the damage was already done. The internet had crowned its victor. And though Trump kept talking, kept spinning, the moment had already been clipped, captioned, and etched into the cultural memory of the conversation. But here's the twist: as massive as this mic drop moment was, it wasn't the peak of the podcast. Because what came next wasn't just a clash between two men. It was a cultural earthquake. The Rogan counterpunch was still echoing when the internet did what it does best: it detonated. Within hours of the episode dropping, timelines across Twitter, X, TikTok, and YouTube turned into a digital bonfire. The clip of Trump stammering while Rogan calmly contradicted him became the viral moment. Reposted, remixed, slowed down, overdubbed with music. One version looped Rogan's line, "That doesn't add up," over a dramatic bass drop. Another turned Trump's stumble into an auto-tuned chorus. By sunrise the next morning, it wasn't just a clip, it was a cultural event. Hashtags trended globally: Rogan vs Trump and podcast meltdown, fun that doesn't add up. A TikTok creators rushed to make 60-second breakdowns, freeze, framing Trump's darting eyes, analyzing Rogan's body language, captioning every hesitation. YouTube commentators put out hour-long reaction and analysis streams, dissecting the confrontation like it was the Zapruder film of political podcasts. Even journalists, often wary of elevating viral content, couldn't resist. The headlines poured in. Trump meets his match in Rogan showdown. The Atlantic, a defining podcast moment of the decade. Rolling Stone, the clip that shook the campaign. The Guardian, suddenly, what was supposed to be a long, meandering 3-hour conversation had been distilled into a 10-second turning point, and that 10 seconds was being replayed by millions who didn't even watch the full episode. For Trump supporters, the spin was immediate. On right-leaning platforms, influencers framed the moment as proof of authenticity. That's just Trump being real. One pundit argued. He's not polished, he's not scripted. He's human. That's why people love him. Others doubled down harder. Rogan was wrong. Trump was right, the media is twisting it again. But for Trump's critics, the clip was a gift, a talking point served on a silver platter. To them, it wasn't just a bad look, it was evidence. Proof, they argued, that Trump wasn't untouchable anymore. One commentator wrote, "If he can't hold his ground in a podcast chair, how can he handle the weight of a presidency again?" And then came the celebrity ripple effect. Actors, comedians, musicians, the voices who don't normally wade into politics, started posting the clip. One late-night host opened their monologue with it, complete with dramatic reenactment. A stand-up comic stitched it on TikTok, pretending to be Trump fumbling his way out of Rogan's question, and racked up millions of views overnight. It became bigger than politics. It was pop culture. The meme economy exploded. GIFs of Trump's stammer, Rogan's raised eyebrows, and captions like, "When you get caught lying in group chat," flooded Instagram and Twitter. Even sports accounts and food brands jumped in, using the moment to promote themselves. When frozen pizza brands are using your podcast stumble to sell pepperoni, you know the cultural shockwave is real. But the most surprising ripple, it wasn't laughter. It was debate. For the first time in a long time, people across the political spectrum were arguing about the same 10 seconds. Some defended, some mocked, some just marveled at the fact that a podcast, not a debate stage, not a rally, not even a courtroom, could deliver such a defining confrontation. And that's what made it so powerful. It didn't feel staged. It didn't feel prepped. It felt raw, unfiltered, and inescapable. The kind of moment where the mask slipped, and no amount of spin could completely erase what millions had already seen. By the end of the week, the question wasn't just what happened on Rogan's podcast. It was, what does this mean for Trump's campaign? For Rogan's influence? For the way we consume politics in the podcast age? Everyone had an answer. Nobody could agree. And that uncertainty only fueled the fire. But here's the thing, as massive as the viral shockwaves were, the sixth takeaway wasn't just about hashtags and headlines. It was personal. For nearly 3 hours, Donald Trump played the role he knows best. The fighter, the showman, the dealmaker who always claims to have the upper hand. But in the final stretch of the conversation, something shifted. Almost by accident, he revealed a side of himself that his rallies, his press conferences, and even his Truth Social posts never show. It came in a fleeting moment, almost buried between stories. Trump, reflecting on his time in office, let slip a confession, not of guilt, but of nostalgia and fear. He spoke of sleepless nights, of the crushing weight of decisions, of wondering how history would remember him. For a man who thrives on projecting invincibility, the mask cracked. And for just a second, listeners didn't hear the bluster. They heard the insecurity of someone who knows the story he's written isn't entirely in his control. The silence that followed wasn't awkward this time. It was heavy, real. Even Rogan, usually quick to pivot or prod, let it linger. The audience could feel it. Behind the slogans and soundbites, Trump is just as haunted by legacy as anyone else. And here's where the moral clarity emerged. Because in that moment, the real arrow of the podcast wasn't Trump's performance or Rogan's questions. It was the truth itself. Truth doesn't roar. It doesn't bluster. It doesn't bully. Truth waits patiently, and when it finally breaks through, it doesn't need to dominate. It simply is. And in that one human crack in Trump's armor, millions were reminded of something bigger than politics. Authenticity matters more than performance. For years, Trump's brand has been built on dominance. The bigger rally, the louder slogan, the harsher insult. But the lesson of this podcast is that America, and democracy itself, isn't about dominance. It's about accountability. It's about the courage to face uncomfortable truths, to admit limits, to embrace the messy humanity that lies beneath every leader's image. That's why the sixth takeaway matters more than the viral clips, more than the memes, more than the headlines. It wasn't about Rogan winning or Trump losing. It was about a rare, raw reminder that the strongest leaders aren't those who shout the loudest. They're the ones who let truth speak, even when it hurts. And that's what resonated with the audience on a deeper level. People didn't just laugh or mock or argue over this moment. They felt it. Because we've all been there. We've all worn masks. We've all tried to project strength while quietly battling doubt. And when a public figure as larger than life as Trump lets that slip, it reminds us, nobody is above humanity. The universal value here is simple, but powerful. Authenticity outlasts arrogance. We don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, truth whispers, and the world listens. And that whisper, more than any rant or rally, may end up defining Trump's 3 hours with Joe Rogan. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. But the story doesn't end there. Because what comes after truth is choice. And there you have it. 6 takeaways from Donald Trump's 3 Our sit down with Joe Rogan, each more shocking than the last. From contradictions and awkward silences, to viral shockwaves and a rare glimpse of raw humanity, this wasn't just a podcast. It was a stage where arrogance and dignity wrestled in real time. If there's one thing these 6 moments proved, it's that the mask always slips. You can bluster, you can dominate, you can perform. But truth always finds a way through. And when it does, it doesn't just expose weakness. It elevates dignity. That's the moral clarity this conversation leaves us with. Arrogance collapses under its own weight, while truth, no matter how quiet, endures. And now, the choice is yours. Subscribe. Join the movement where truth always triumphs over noise. Share. Send this to someone who doubts the power of honest conversation. Comment. Which takeaway hit you the hardest? And why? This isn't just about one podcast or one politician. It's about what kind of voices we choose to amplify, what kind of conversations we choose to share, and what kind of America we want to believe in. Because at the end of the day, politics is theater, but truth is legacy. And as this podcast proved, no matter how many hours of noise fill the airwaves, truth doesn't need volume to win. It just needs a moment. Because when truth speaks, even 3 hours of noise can't silence it.